Welcome to the IPP Web Conference, No Opting Out of CCPA's Data Rights, brought to you today by Big ID. My name is Dave Cohen. I'm the IPP's Knowledge Manager. I'll be your host for today's program. We'll be getting started with the presentation in just a minute, but before we do, a few program details. Participating in today's program will automatically provide IPP-certified privacy professionals who are the named registrants with 1 CPE credit. Others who are listening in can apply for that credit through an easy-to-use online form on our website. We'd also like to remind you that today's program is being recorded and will be provided free to registered attendees approximately 48 hours following live event. We encourage you to ask questions at any time during the program, and to do that you can just type them in the Q&A field that's just to the right of your PowerPoint window. Your questions will be answered by the presenters after the presentation. We may actually take the questions in line too, so please feel free to ask the questions at any time during the program. And now, with that, I would like to introduce today's panelists. Deb Farber is Senior Director of Privacy Strategy at Big ID. Deborah, welcome to the program today. And can you tell us a little bit about your role over there at Big ID and also what you've done previously?
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. At Big ID, I'm Senior Director of Privacy Strategy, and I have the pleasure of evangelizing privacy and why it's so important for businesses to operationalize and comply with the various regulations out there, but operationalize privacy and data protection into their enterprises and businesses. I also work on thought leadership around privacy by design and privacy engineering and such, and engage the legal community to make sure they understand a lot about how Big ID's products can help the compliance with CCPA, GDPR, and other privacy regulations. I've been I'm a lawyer by training, but I've actually not practiced. Instead, I went straight into operationalizing privacy, and I've spent 14 years managing privacy and security programs at companies like Visa, IBM, American Express, TrustArc, and the advisory board companies. I'm also the vice chair of the U.S. Technology Advisory Group, which is providing guidance on the global stage for the ISO Privacy by Design standard. And I'm really excited to be here today.
Terrific. Thanks, Deborah. It's great to have you with us. And joining Deborah on the panel today, Robert Glosser is Specialist Leader, Privacy and Data Protection, Cyber Risk Services at Deloitte. Robert, welcome to the program, and can you tell us a little bit about your professional background?
Sure. So Robert Glosser, happy to meet everybody virtually. I've been with Deloitte for about 6 years, having come from industry. With Deloitte, I specialize in assisting companies through the assessment, design, and build and operationalization of privacy programs. Obviously, for about the last 2 years, been doing primarily GDPR, presently moving heavily into CCPA. Prior to joining Deloitte, I was Chief Privacy Officer at Genentech and Roche USA prior to that, and have been in privacy since about 2003. Prior to that was a healthcare CIO and spent 24 years in the Navy. So we've watched the world of privacy evolve, and this is a continuation of that evolution as well as the professionalism of privacy. And I look forward to providing my section of the presentation today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Robert. And with that, let's go ahead and get started with the program. And for that, I'm going to hand it off to Deborah. Deborah, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you. So with the CCPA, we've got a new privacy sheriff in town, right, compared to in the past where we've had other regulators, some of them sectoral in the U.S., some of them global, or I should say regional, but in other countries. Here we've got something that's very GDPR-like happening in the United States. So there are new consumer data protection rights. And with data protection rights, that becomes obligations that for companies. So there's this consumers in California or residents of California have a right to know information that a company personal information that a company is collecting about them, right to access that information, a right to disclosure, a right to opt out of the sale of that information, and a right to have their information deleted. I'm going to go through these briefly in the following slides. But what I want to, for each of these points here, what I want you to take away is that each of these rights has obligations on the company. So now an organization needs to establish and build and maintain a data inventory in order to effectuate any of these rights. Within the CCPA is an expanded definition within the United States of personal information. It's very similar to the GDPR definition, and we'll unpack that. But personal information is data that's linked or linkable to a California consumer or household, not just identifiable or personally identifiable information, which most privacy laws in the United States had referred to in the past. So we'll unpack what personal information means in the following slides. And so this establishes a need to determine and monitor the identifiability of all the data that an organization has collected. In addition, there's actual real enforcement here. This law has teeth. There are state attorney general fines for violations and data breach notification lapses per incident beginning July 1st, 2020. And even earlier, about 6 months earlier from that, is when California consumers have the ability to sue. They have a private right of action to sue for privacy violations and inadequate protection against breaches. So that's coming up quickly, January 1st, 2020. And then lastly, there needs to be accountability in data processing. As we'll go through this, you'll see that you need to operationalize opt-out decisions and then delineate between what information is sold, transferred, and just generally processed data. So first, let's discuss the right to know. The CCPA grants consumers the right to request that businesses disclose the categories and specific pieces of personal information the business has collected about them. So again, with the right to know comes the company's obligation to disclose. And, consumer has the ability to send a request to say, I'd like to know all the information that you sent about me. That verifiable consumer request means that a business must put processes in place to be able to, discuss what categories of personal information that is collected about him or her, the categories of the sources from which the personal information was collected, the business purposes behind collecting that personal information, the categories of third parties with whom the business has shared that information, and then the specific pieces of personal information as collected about the consumer. So for a compliance note, information must be updated at least every 12 months. And what that practically means is then when this law goes into effect, that on January, when it goes into effect, the regulators as of July 1st, 2020, will say, you must be able to, when a consumer comes to you with a request to exercise the right to know request, that you must have a look-back period of 12 months where you're able to provide all that data from the preceding 12 months that has been, kept up to date in your system. And so what that practically means is that you don't have that much time to get your house in order to be able to provide this information for this 12-month look-back period. In addition, any additional secondary uses of personal data that are different from which you've originally told them that you were going to use the data at the point of collecting that information and within your privacy policy at the point of collection, you would now need to provide notice to the consumer of their rights and their right to know and their right to request information about them. So you'll also have to, part of the right to know is to update your privacy policies to explain the rights of the individual under the CCPA. In addition, there's a right to access. So in those consumer requests, this is kind of flows from the previous slide, but consumer requests a copy of the specific personal information that businesses retain about him or her. So the right to access isn't just what are the categories, Now it's, okay, you've got these categories. I'd like to know what specific data you hold about me. So the good thing is that consumers are only allowed to make this request twice in a year. So it's not like they can fill you with denial of service attack level of requests constantly coming in over and over and over again. They're only allowed to legally, make these requests, twice a year. However, practically that means that you'll need to have processes in place to govern those requests to make sure that those that the right to access is being actionable, and so that you can comply with the regulation. Businesses must provide a California consumer with access to personal information that's held by the business and deliver it in a readily usable format that allows porting the data to another entity without hindrance. And so what this really is here, within the right to access, there is this kind of implied right to portability that's similar to GDPR that allows you to be able to receive that data in a way that's readily usable and that you can bring and port over to another organization. Information must be provided free of charge. That's pretty clear. You can't charge exorbitant fees to deflate the cost of providing this governance in the first place and these rights. There is an exception to that right that it's not applicable to information that's collected for a single transaction as long as the information is not sold or retained for the purpose of linking it to personal information. So for instance, a great example of this is a guest checkout capability, right? You want to, let's see, I don't want to log into an e-commerce company. I just want to one-time buy something for it. Maybe it's a baby registry, and I don't have children, so I never really need to go back to this particular website, but I do want to buy something in that one moment in time. So because I'm never logged in, maybe I'm not fully identified by the business, and it's just a one-time transaction. There's no need under the law to maintain a record of that particular transaction where they couldn't identify me in the first place. What's also interesting to note about the right to access is that unlike the GDPR, there isn't a right to amend your data if it's incorrect, or a right to, right of rectification, which is pretty much the right to amend your data, but that's what it's referred to in GDPR. It's not such a big deal since, one would assume with all the other requirements that a company has to adhere to that you're not, you wouldn't want to keep incorrect information because, the consumer would just leave and wouldn't trust you anymore. So if you have to provide the access and the ability to delete the data in the first place, you might as well incentivize people to be able to amend incorrect data so that they don't request to have it deleted to instill that trust. But it is important to note that that's not a separate right under CCPA. The right to access also has so we talked about the implied right of portability. So a business must provide a California consumer with access to personal information that's held by the business and to obtain it in a readily usable format that allows porting the data to another entity. The time period is without hindrance. So you can't spend, months and months. This needs to be something that's done without delay and without hindrance is kind of a legal term, and that would be determined by other factors such as case law and perhaps clarification from the California Attorney General in the future. Consumers may make this request to a business no more than twice a year. Okay, we already went over that. And the business is not required to include data that are obtained in a one-time transaction. Or, this is kind of flowing from the other slide, I do think it's a little redundant, but they're also not required to re-identify or link information that is not already in an identifiable form. So, the big takeaway is here that, prepare, don't panic. If you've already been working on GDPR compliance, you've gotten a lot of the way there in terms of operationalizing data protection rights within your enterprise. Because this is really where we need the the privacy office, the attorneys, the policy folks within an organization to work hand in hand with the more technical folks in the organization to, maybe your privacy engineers or your IT teams to make all the required governance changes and, basically to to make sure you have the capability to honor opt-outs, the ability to address the access and deletion requests at scale and with minimal impact to the business, and to and to respect and operationalize all opt-out requests for the sale of consumers. So one of the things I didn't have a slide to, but I would like to speak about here is that that consumers have the right to opt out of the sale of consumers' personal information. And so as part of that, it's similar to GDPR's right to withdraw consent, except that it only applies to the sale of information. You don't have a right to opt out of all things under CCPA, but you do for the sale of consumer information. So let's unpack that a little bit. Where an organization buys, rents, or sells personal information to other companies, the Act requires them to keep a record of all sales for 12 months and to provide a clear and conspicuous link on its website with the call to action, do not sell my personal information, so that people may easily opt out of that practice if they want to. And then the Act requires even more of those that sell the personal information of children who are 16 years old or younger. And then this link or button, and other, permission requests that you kind of bake into your user experience would surely, raise privacy concerns for many potential clients and prospects. And that could, result in a loss of their trust. So as you would imagine, as the passage of CCPA is kind of shining a light on the practices of data brokers and advertisers, there's going to be a great many California consumers that will make requests that their data not be sold, and then maybe reevaluate the business models. Or I should say, companies should reevaluate their business models now, prepare, and implement changes before the 2020 enforcement date, because the Act appears to also undercut our current self-regulatory advertising framework in the U.S. There aren't laws in the United States that really regulate advertising and privacy so much as it was a self-regulatory model. And now the California law is kind of upending that. And so it'll be interesting to watch how the industry practices are going to evolve. But, right now, you also need, under CCPA, you are allowed to collect affirmative authorizations from children between the ages of 13 and 16 to sell their personal information. So now you'd also have to manage their opt-ins, which have the legal hurdle of having to be affirmative authorizations. So, basically, under the Act, a covered business shall not sell the personal information of consumers if the business has actual knowledge that the consumer is under the age of 16 years of age, unless affirmative authorization of the sale of personal information has been granted. And so, similar to COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, businesses are required to get opt-in consent for children under the age of 13, except the CCPA then carves out this other exception that's very different from like GDPR, right, where children between the ages of 13 and 16 have this other kind of ability to affirmatively authorize a business to sell their personal information without parental consent. And so to comply with this provision, like companies that sell personal information, like data brokers and advertisers, must put in place processes and technology that can detect whether they capture or infer the ages of children under 16 years old. You can even imagine with gaming companies as well, this would be applicable. So next, those companies will need to decide, does it make sense to sell this data, or, should we stop doing that, sell it from these consumers, or should we implement effective consent management and auditing processes to manage opt-in affirmative authorization to sell personal information. So, you should start preparing now, not panic, understand the regulatory space, and then determine what technologies you're going to use to help with automating some of this. And after I pass the baton over to Robert, I will come back and talk about Big ID and how we address some of these areas. But for now, I'm going to leave you with the deletion aspect. So you have the right to delete personal information if the business is not required by law to retain. And then privacy compliance with CCPA goes beyond traditional notice and choice requirements. Right now, as it sits today, CCPA is really around the ability to put control back into the hands of the consumers around the data that they've provided, data about them, and to really effectuate that control through opt-ins, opt-outs, and these data protection rights granted under CCPA. And so with that, Robert, I'll pass the baton to you.
Thanks a bunch, and appreciate it, Deborah. A lot of what Deborah just said lends itself to my portion of the presentation, which is more operational and operational considerations. So the first thing I wanted to say is readiness takes a village. As we found with GDPR, it's not just IT, it's not just compliance, it's not just legal, it's not just procurement, it's not just human resources. But to appropriately approach CCPA, it's got to be an organization-wide endeavor. And with that, then the organization has to make some foundational decisions. Are we going to approach California uniquely? Are we going to approach California in conjunction with our other jurisdictional requirements? And are we going to approach California as part of our global program? We oftentimes, while dealing with GDPR engagements, and we, Deloitte, did about 250 of those over the past couple of years, saw that the companies that were most successful had a leadership view into the mechanisms of compliance, many times had centralized funding, and in fact it was IT and technology where the bulk of the spend was versus operationalization or administrative type procedures. Basically, to do this, you're going to have to use it from the perspective of the entire organization, from a resource perspective, both human and financial. And where California goes, the rest of the nation could follow or tends to follow. If you think about it, California had the first data breach law in the country. We now have 50 states with data breach laws, many of which almost verbatim follow California. California has the Confidentiality of Medical Information Act, and while that is a carve-out under CCPA, the reality is other states have put in laws specific to health information. Texas, for example, under Health and Safety Code 181. So where Europe goes, much of the world follows, and we see that. But where California goes, much of the U.S. follows, and we have to also take into consideration that our own federal government is finally appearing to get serious about a federal law. So you have to take that into account when you tie it back to California has a strong history of enforcement. In California, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, many of those states are leading the way in terms of the actions of their attorneys general and how they take care of their citizenry. And for the record, California in this is extraterritorial, much like GDPR is, because the definition of a California resident defers to the California tax code, which essentially says that if you pay taxes in the state of California, you're a resident. And we're waiting on clarification for those types of questions. But in theory, there could be a student at the University of North Carolina who had a summer job in California who pays taxes. I, as a consultant, pay taxes in California. So the definition of a resident is very wide-ranging, and you can't just think about the borders of California. And then you also have to think about the assertiveness of how California has traditionally enforced its regulations. And then lastly, as Deborah mentioned a while ago, it has onerous and European-like requirements. we say that it brings European GDPR to the United States. And while it's not 100% GDPR, there is a then overlap of the requirements that are common amongst GDPR and the California CCPA. So if you bring all of this together and you think about a compliance date of January 1 of 2020, and you couple that with from about November 15 to the end of the year, times 2, and you think about the summer holiday period, and you think about the folks who are supporting your business, the reality is we're now about 14 months out from the compliance date, and you have 8 to 9 months of true work period in order to come into compliance. And if you are with a company who has not executed a GDPR program on a global basis, we found that many companies in executing GDPR, it took them 1.5 to 2 years to get fully defensible. And we believe that the same thing is going to be appropriate for California. The purpose of this slide on the principal amendments to CCPA is to say, look, CCPA was passed in June, and the first set of amendments came out in September. And many of us are looking for rulemaking, clarification, and anticipating that further amendments will occur to CCPA in 2019. And rulemaking may not even be completed until the spring of 2020. However, there are core aspects of CCPA which will never be changed. And in that perspective, you have to think about the holistic program itself and what the purpose of the program is, and to set forth a good faith effort to become definitionally ready or defensible should you be inspected by a regulator or should you be questioned by your consumers. And we expect that further amendments will come down. One of the big ones that's often talked about is employees. Are employees consumers or are employees employees? Are you as a company going to make a value-based decision to treat employees differently than consumers, or are you going to treat everybody the same? Is California going to be part of your global program, or is California going to be unique? So as you begin to look at these types of first series amendments, redefining personal information, expanding HIPAA exemption, reference to Graham-Leach-Bliley, limitations on privacy or right of action, limits penalty to $7,500 for each violation. So as we begin to look at intentional or violations and intentional violations, what's the definition of a violation? If I were to fine a large multinational $2,500 as a single fine, that's no big deal. But if you had a breach of 500,000 individuals times $2,500, that's a huge number. So we're beginning to really look at these numbers and these expectations as for further clarification. As we move into some leading practices as it relates to CCPA, we're really leveraging our history with GDPR. So the first thing that you need to do is to think about updating your data classification program, redefining what personal information is, and ensuring that your policies, standards, processes, technologies all match as it relates to that. And then secondarily, you have to consider, as I referenced earlier, California or the United States, where we see leading practices are one and done. The complexity, and what we mean by that is the complexity of operating multiple privacy programs is significant. And because of that, you have to look at how you're going to govern the actual effort and how you're going to validate that things like data destruction, data classification, the provision of personal information all come into play. Records of processing activities, inventorying the processes, procedures, and systems. So as an example, there's one of the questions that's on the board is, would you recommend the general approach of producing categories of third parties with whom info was shared? Absolutely. You need to know who you sent that information to, what information you sent, what their destruction policies are, whether they're getting requests for records of processing or records requests, and how you're going to interact with them. And if you don't have a full system inventory, if you are not interacting with your agencies of record, you're going to have a major problem. Now, you can break them down into, say, this vendor has general personal data and this vendor might have sensitive personal data as defined by the EU, or other forms of regulated data such as Social Security number, government-issued identifiers, bank account information. But the reality is you need to have core sources of record, and those records need to be updated. You need to have a risk ranking criteria so that you understand what the organizational risk is reputationally and financially. You need to look at human change management. This isn't just IT change management, but it's human capital change management, and how are you going to change the culture of the organization, as well as setting up privacy by design standards. Now, you look at the law and it doesn't say much of that, but the expectation behind the verbiage that's contained in the law indicates that much of this is going to be a requirement. And if you're going to have a privacy program that dovetails nicely with Europe, it's just an extension. The problem is that many companies, when they did the European GDPR implementation, did not include the United States or rest of the world. So this work is brand new. And many companies also may operate only within the jurisdiction of the U.S. So this is new. So for a lot of companies, they're just getting ready to start out. The next one is portability and erasure. What's the scope of data for portability and erasure? What are the retention requirements? There is no easy button, meaning there's no one button that you can push and make all of this happen. And while we, Deloitte, are technology agnostic, companies like Big ID and others in the marketplace offer solutions that can address many of these, or part of these, or all of these as they're going through the process. And those types of solutions become very important. Are you going to have a manual-based process? Are you going to have a technology-based process? But regardless, you need to start with systems of record. You need to make sure that those systems are integrated into the retention schedule. Those systems and what's contained in them need to be contained within the long-term vision and strategy of the organization. Do you consider yourself a data company? Do you consider yourself an operating company? Do you consider yourself a marketing company? And how does the records that you keep from a legitimate business purpose then support the strategy of the business? And which of those records that you keep from a legitimate business purpose increase the risks to the business? And you also have to consider ad hoc responsibilities, or ad hoc responses versus technology enablement. And Deborah indicated some of that, and I just talked about this, but we have seen many companies post-GDPR go live where there was an influx of requests for information where they were executing their access rights. The individuals were executing access rights, and it's tailed off. So many companies handled this and are handling this with an administrative and manual process. Other companies, in preparation for what they believe to be a large-scale influx once the requirements become better known, are implementing technologies to address this. And it may be a phase 1, phase 2 approach, but the reality is you have to make that decision up front. And then consent. Deborah talked a lot about consent, but you need to be able to update your authentication mechanisms. How do you really know that it's in the individual? So we have companies from a GDPR perspective and other companies that, and I've seen this myself, where just from a login perspective on a customer-based website, I am getting a multi-factor authentication text into my mobile phone in order to log in, to make sure it's really me. Enterprise consent management solutions, we're beginning to see a lot of master data management solutions. When you begin to put in all of these factors, and you have to manage opt-in and opt-out, and you don't have a central system of opt-in, opt-out, and you have agencies of record who are working on your behalf. If you do not have a master data management solution or some sort of a solution that addresses all the sources of information that come in to create a unique individual, then you have risk in your company. And the biggest thing, and Deborah talked about this, is you need to know for sure which data is actually being sold. So the housing of data, the utilization for a business purpose is one thing, but what is the data that's being sold, and what forms of data are being sold? Are they de-identified? Are they pseudo-anonymized? Are they identifiable? Is it contained within the consent statement? Is it contained within your privacy statement online? These, again, fall within the purview of what you need to seriously consider. Security. So we talk a lot under GDPR and other laws about security for privacy, and historically states such as Massachusetts and California have led the way. But as we've watched companies come through the GDPR process, many companies were looking at ISO from a European standard. They were looking at NIST from a U.S. standard. And what they're trying to figure out is what standard do we follow, and what's a best practice or an industry-leading practice or a common practice. And what we're beginning to see are companies who have developed what I'll call a controls framework for security, where they have consolidated NIST and ISO into a single controls framework along with other similar type of expectations such as the security requirements in HIPAA, and that's what they're going with. Monitoring, encryption, tokenization, loss prevention capabilities, companies have to make a basic decision from a risk perspective where they may have put these off, that now this impetus and the risk to the company is demanding that these types of technologies be put into place. And that's where the risk versus reward comes into play. And every company we work with has a different risk tolerance. Some have a higher tolerance, some have a lower tolerance. One of the things that you absolutely need to do is look at your incident response plans, your forensic capabilities, and conduct wargaming, whether it be tabletop exercises or actual exercises. Also, you have to make a decision of how you're going to conduct breach notification. If you have global databases, and the Europeans require notification to a regulatory authority within 72 hours, whereas this law says you have to make notification in 30 days, are you going to defer notifying the California Attorney General or the other appropriate regulatory agencies for 27 days after you've notified the Europeans? Or are you going to notify in the same time frame? So each of these nuances has to be looked at in conjunction with your global footprint. And then, of course, encryption is a safe harbor under CCPA. And so what we already have are a number of companies that are just talking about flipping the encryption key and encrypting in transit and in storage to avoid many of the risks that are associated with breach. Third party, inventorying all of your third parties who process personal data on your behalf or for whom you receive personal data from. Do you know for a fact that the data that you have purchased from that third party has been procured in accordance with these requirements? Do you have the contractual obligations? Do you know for a fact that your data processors are in fact complying with the obligations? Do you know that they are not using it for their own purposes? Which contracts do you need to amend? And we have seen companies with thousands of contracts that need to be amended or to have reference while we were dealing with the GDPR. So which of the contracts are you going to amend, and how are you going to identify them? And we actually have a solution where artificial intelligence is being used to read contracts to assist in identifying these types of elements. And who do you assess? Are you going to assess those vendors that process the most sensitive forms of personal information on your behalf? You're going to assess all vendors, or are you going to assess those vendors that you select randomly, or are you going to put the right to audit and assess in a contract and then decide not to execute? You have to make those decisions. And breach preparedness, I talked a little bit about that a while ago, but breach preparedness is key, and testing your breach response program is key. Understanding the interface between security and privacy is key. Technology enablement now or later, as well as the maturity of your privacy landscape. Which technologies are you going to implement, and how are you going to do them? What's your vendor analysis under a short and a long-term strategy? Management. You know, we talked a while ago, and I talked, and Deborah indicated, will CCPA be modified? Will it be further amendment? How is it going to be enforced? we know California historically enforces pretty seriously, but is CCPA going to be enforced at the same level, a higher level, a lower level? And what's my business risk? What's the categories of personal information? Do I sell to mom and pop shops? Are they consumers? Or do I sell to individuals, and do I interact with individuals and I'm tracking them from a purchase habit perspective? And what's the change culture? How are you going to change your organization? And how are you going to manage the employees in your organization? When I was in industry, I often said I was going to give people bracelets that said, "What about Bob?" And what I mean by that is, how does privacy interact with the business? How large is the privacy office? What's the value to the business? Privacy is no longer writing policies and procedures and just interpreting law. Privacy really now is part of the operational culture of an organization and has to be integrated into the business and strategy development of the organization, or risk inside the organization will and continues to increase. As we begin to look at CCPA readiness, you really have to assess and then build and then operationalize. So as you begin to assess, you want to look at your existing documentation, your existing people, process, technologies, your existing strategies, roadmaps, and project planning. And what I mean is this is strategies and roadmaps not only for the technology and core business, but strategies and roadmap for your own privacy office. I mentioned during my introduction that I've watched the professionalism of the professional nature of privacy be enhanced over the past 15 years. For many years, I fought to be recognized as a legitimate professional, and for many years, I fought for privacy to be legitimized as a true profession. GDPR, CCPA, they are the Full Employment Act for privacy professionals. So it's a great time to be a privacy geek. But if you're going to do that, you have to become part of the business and the business culture and the business strategy. And then putting together the budget. This is where a lot of companies in GDPR seriously underestimated the complexity of GDPR and seriously underestimated the business. And if you haven't been, the complexity and the cost of GDPR. And if you haven't been through that process already for GDPR, you're going to need to go through that process for CCPA. And the success is often with centralized budgeting rather than fragmented budgeting. And how willing is your organization to absorb either the risk or the resource needs? As you begin to look at phase 2, which is really the design and build phase, you're going to have to look at planning for the entire program. And remember earlier I said something like there's 8 months left. You're going to have to look at your policies and notice how you're going to manage consent and how you're going to manage individual rights access. What's your security for privacy? What's your existing security posture? There were times in my past life where CISOs were my worst nightmare. Now, for the first time, not for the first time, over the past few years, I've seen the cooperation among IT security and privacy become significantly higher than ever before. And I'm beginning to see many CISOs who are now asking for direction and specifics from the privacy office of what's the minimum expectation. And I'm thrilled to see that because there were times I had to fight to get that attention. Putting privacy by design into play, and not only designing it, but executing it and then validating it. Again, I talked about human capital change management. I talked about procurement and third-party risk management. Organization and the operating model. Are you going to have no privacy office? Are you going to have a 50% time? Are you going to have 12 people? What's your operating model for privacy? Are you going to use privacy stewards throughout the organization? Are you going to dovetail this as part of your global privacy program? Metrics and reporting, what are they? Incident response, test them. Data inventory, get it. And data protection impact assessments, document it. There's a few questions on here. I'm going to see if any of them real quick. Can you talk a little bit broad about the deletion exemption? I think I'm going to defer that a little bit to Deborah. Can you define the scoping of opt-out cookies and tracking? That's a technology question. I'm going to defer to Deborah. And then there was a question about, are there exceptions similar to GDPR for clinical research? Having come from a pharmaceutical company, I would tell you that under clinical research, you have the informed consent, the ICFs, the informed consent that all the patients, and most of those have gone through some sort of an IRB, an institutional review board. And that institutional review board generally operates clinical research under HIPAA. And I am not an attorney, and I do not provide legal advice. I am a consultant. But what I would tell you is I think a case can be made that would say that a clinical trial participant and clinical research is not consumer marketing. And because of the other protections that are granted, I think clinical research could be a limited carve-out. And that is one of the areas that I would expect to see that the state would continue to address in the future. Then finally, from the operationalization and implementation perspective, it's not just writing policies, it's actually ensuring that the policies that you put out there are followed. It's not just saying you have a rights management, but testing and how and putting that into play. So all of these things that are in phase 2, it's really validating what in phase 3, it's really executing what you've designed in phase 2, and not only just putting the policy and procedure out there, but testing that it actually works the way that you expect it to work, and that people have changed. People are incorporating that into their day-to-day business. So one way that many of these programs can be managed is with technology. And Deborah's going to follow on here in just a second. That say technology can help you do more with less. And the key here is, let's say you've got 500 data rights requests. I'm just making this up. If you had to manually execute data rights requests and you got 500 of them in, it would be hell to do. So in that perspective, then, maybe technology can help. Master data management. If you have to combine multiple systems into place in order to manage consent, or you have to go to look at all your third parties and 16 systems in-house to see if somebody's opted out, that's complexity. So the point here is that technology can help you with your CCPA programs and can help you leverage more with less. So data inventories. You can use technology to do your inventories. We've seen artificial intelligence, we've seen e-discovery, we've seen data loss prevention, and we've seen other technologies that crawl the networks to do inventories. Consent management, master data management. Individuals can now opt out of sharing. How are you going to incorporate this into your program? And Deborah indicated that earlier. Individual rights. Deletion, access, and other data subject rights may be impractical to execute from a manual perspective. So can you completely process these in an automated fashion using your IT systems? There are technologies out there that can help you do that. Incident response and breach. Detection prior to is important, but also preparation for the potential of can help you create more resilient systems. So automated notification requirements against characteristics of incident allow for expedited workflow. And that's not unlike what data loss prevention does. So as we begin to look at how technology can help meet the requirements and technology can help you implement the program, this is a section that Deborah would like to talk about. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Deborah. And then at the end, Dave and others will make sure that we address any questions that we've missed. So thank you once again.
Great, thanks, Robert. That was just super informative about kind of comprehensively how companies should attack, this challenge. And just to build on that, our CCPA building blocks are, you need a combination of the policies, the accountability and transparency by consumer. You also need the technology aspect in order to find personal data. And you want to do this not just by search of like the person's name and hoping things show up, right? I mean, you need to find context and what data is associated with other data that makes it personal information. right? Because personal information is anything that's linked or linkable to an identity. And especially for enterprises, it's very, very difficult to, delete personal information upon a deletion or request if you don't know where all of the linkable personal information lives within your enterprise. So technology is key. In addition, you want to map and inventory personal information by consumer. So you want to understand where is an individual consumer's personal information throughout your systems specifically, and then be able to categorize those. And then you need processes to operationalize and fulfill privacy lifecycle management as outlined by Robert. Okay, let's see, that didn't move. Okay. So, Big ID addresses this in several ways. First, to address the data, consumer data rights, we need like a privacy intelligence, right? You need insight into your own data. So you can do this with Big ID through data discovery of the personal information across your entire environment. Through our machine learning and AI technology, you can also, the technology will correlate the personal data based on the consumer's identity. And it'll find other data that is connected to an identity. And we do this by, as Robert said, starting with the systems of record. How do you define what an identity is within an organization? Well, you look at kind of what you consider to be the source of identity, whether it's a combination of, Salesforce information combined with, some other databases and data stores. And then, we take that and feed our machine learning model, and this is an on-premise solution, so you're not actually, it's not SaaS. We're not a data processor here. This is something installed locally behind the company's firewall, and it pretty much, we scan all of the data stores throughout your organization through an API-first model, and then find like attributes to the identities that you've considered in your system of identity systems of record, and then we find attributes that are similar and then correlate that to an identity, index it, and then classify. So that inventory and index capability is what allows you to kind of have that Google-like search within our platform to find personal information. And then as new data sources come on board, because you're constantly changing your business environment, and new applications are added, new attributes are introduced, you will do, continued scans that allow for dynamic data maps, and that's kind of the image you can see up there, that you've got a personal data inventory with a visual data mapping of your business processes and how information flows through your business process. And that also allows for finding individual, finding things like data residency. And oh my gosh, why is this, German person's data found all the way in, I don't know, in Africa, where it, shouldn't have left Germany, or something along those lines. You can understand the risks to your information with that data insight and 360-degree view into your personal information. In addition, we have a consumer-centric view that's generated from the inventory that basically provides the basis for privacy protection and reporting. So you can understand where the personal information was found, what categories of data are collected. So that was one of the questions that was asked. How can you provide the categories of data that are collected? Well, first you have to discover them and find them and make them contextualized. How the data is related to a consumer. So, the technology has the ability to kind of explain how that data has been linked to an individual, down to, what database or file share or, cloud service it was found in. And then you can add the justification for collection. So, you can add into this report, and you'd have an automatic generated, for GDPR it would be a data subject access request reports, and for California Consumer Privacy Act, it's just an access report, right? You can basically on demand press the press of a button to run the report generation, and it'll give this view of all of the data collected about an individual that you can provide back to the individual either through your website, through a self-service capability, or kick off to a to the customer service rep who is going to interact with that individual, verify their identity, and send it back to them. So as we've already talked about, CCPA is pretty much here to stay. There's going to be minor tweaks. There's going to be amendments still left to come, as Robert described. However, there's just going to be more tweaks. The data protection rights afforded to the individuals are pretty much the central portion of CCPA, and they're here to stay. So you absolutely need ways to use technology to correlate opt-out decisions to the specific consumer within the data inventory. You want to identify consumer data and locations, and then, of course, identify the specific processing flows for the consumer data sets within your environment. You want to identify the applications and third parties that are part of any data flow. And then, of course, you want to apply any opt-out policies that you've had through your consent management capabilities that you already have in place. You want to apply that to your consumer profile and make sure to have policy tags of those attributes. And so the Big ID platform allows for orchestration of the various consent management softwares that you have and pulls in that information to our discovery capabilities so that you can even see when someone's opted in over here, opted out for a completely different service over there, and it kind of keeps that all in check to be able to provide that back to the consumer when they want to know why you're processing their information or what authority you have to do that. And then also maintain, your policy-based monitoring and alerting for continuous compliance, because, this isn't a one and done situation. This is going to now be a consistent monitoring and governance capability that will enable your organization to continue to comply with CCPA down the road. The right to be forgotten and the right to erasure similarities, or under CCPA it's the right to delete. But here's a good example of a request to fulfill that, right? So you get a request to delete someone's personal information from your systems. It might come in from email, web form, mobile app, phone call, however it comes in. Then you want to authenticate that request and then validate that the person is who they say they are. So you're going to validate against your inventory and then issue a response to the consumer. You might say, yes, we are going to provide this to you, or no, we don't have any information in the first place. So you'll respond back. Then you're going to want to generate a list of relevant applications, data sources, and attribute locations for the consumer from your inventory. And then, here's how you would execute on those. Hopefully you have predefined workflows already on how you're going to fulfill these requests. You could generate a ticket, for instance, if you're using Jira for internal ticketing or any other ticketing system. You can then, kick off a ticket to the right person who's going to internally, delete the row from the database that we've identified, or, find that information in a file share and delete it once we identify where it's located. And then, initiate that deletion workflow to IT and then the appropriate application owners, and then initiate the orchestration via APIs. With the ability to mask and de-identify and encrypt, right? Because your ability, deleting might mean rendering, getting rid of any sort of identity, identifiability, right? So you could de-identify that information and perhaps still preserve some value in keeping the data, but eliminating any identifiability by encrypting or de-identifying. And then, queue up which records you want to delete and identify what those are. Then, of course, validate that those workflows have been effectively completed. Validate that against the inventory with the internal consumer access reports, right? So you'll generate the report automatically and then be able to finally deliver that to the report either in whatever way that you want to deliver it, either through your website, through a self-service capability, or, sending it by other means. And so this is pretty much the summary slide here. I know we're at the very end, but I want to leave you with privacy, and the two main things that our platform does that I think are just incredibly unique in the field are our robust privacy intelligence at BigID and our ability to provide privacy assurance. With the intelligence technology, it's for large businesses with many data stores, it's really essential to leverage technology. It's almost impossible to act upon the CCPA requirements without having a clear understanding as to where data lives across your enterprise. You need to map the data flows to illustrate what applications and systems and with whom is that data shared. You need to easily contextualize all the personal information across the company based on an individual consumer's identity, and then facilitate quick organizational responses to consumer access and deletion requests under the Act. You also need to provide privacy assurance for auditing purposes and defend against lawsuits and regulatory actions. And so without the assistance of identity-aware privacy management technology, I don't think large organizations would be able to provide the accurate information required to respond to the influx of consumer requests that the Act, when the Act becomes enforceable. And, so with the privacy assurance aspect, we're giving you complete certainty to know with a high level of certainty, let's just say that, high level of certainty, whose data lives where in your enterprise. So, this is going to satisfy your auditors, your data protection officers, and all the various regulators, whether GDPR, CCPA, or in the other countries that are promulgating privacy regulations, and other states that may do so as well. So, this will help you confidently and effectively manage consent, and then integrate and monitor your data processing. So, this is pretty much the slide I'm going to leave you on, and we've integrated some of the questions into our discussion here as you've been asking them. But let me take a look at this last one. Does BigID have the ability to delete? What about making sure data is removed from unallocated space? So right now, BigID only has read-only access into your data. In the future, we will have some other abilities to take action to be, and we'll discuss that another time. But right now, we do not have the ability to delete, but we do have the ability to identify what needs to be deleted down to the database row, and that, down to the very, very specific locations of the data across all of your data stores, structured, unstructured, semi-structured data. And so, in the future, we will have the ability to do some other things. Another question, does BigID have redaction capabilities? Not yet, but we're working on it, and so we will get back to you on that. And so, Dave, I'm handing this back to you now for questions, but I think we might be out of time.
Yeah, exactly, Deborah. But as you mentioned just a moment ago, you did a terrific job, as did Robert, answering the questions in line. So we had some great questions coming in, but you guys did a terrific job and just integrated them right into the discussion. So we are just about out of time, but as you can see on the slide in front of you now, both Deborah and Robert have made their email addresses available to you graciously. So if you have any further questions or have a question that didn't get answered to your satisfaction, please do feel free to shoot off an email to them. As you can see, my email address is there as well if you have anything that you'd like some help with from me. So with that, let me say a big and hearty thank you to BigID for making this educational web conference available to all of you out there for free. We certainly appreciate it here on the IEPP, and we certainly appreciate BigID's support of our efforts to increase knowledge in the privacy community. They're a great partner, and we love working with them. So thank you to all, and thank you in particular, Deborah and Robert, for spending some time with us today, and both in the preparation for this web conference and also for taking some time with us today. It's much appreciated. And then before you drop off the line, if you're still with us, would very much appreciate some feedback You can click on that link in front of you. It's a very straightforward, very short survey. It takes literally 2 minutes. We've timed it, and just gives you an opportunity to let us know if this webinar met your expectations, if you found what you were looking for when you signed up. And my favorite field in that survey is what would you like to hear about on future programs. So it's a great place for you to let us know what issues and challenges you're wrestling with out there, and we have a huge database of speakers to draw upon, and we can produce that content to help you get your job done in a more effective and efficient manner. So please take literally just 2 minutes, click on that link, give us some feedback, and help us continue to improve our educational offerings. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, if you're an IAPP certified privacy professional and you have your certification with us, which thank you for doing that, and hope it's providing value to you, just listening and watching this webinar will automatically grant you 1 CPE credit, continuing privacy education credit, toward the upkeep of your certification. That's just going to happen automatically if you register. You don't need to do anything. But if for some reason you're listening to this and you didn't actually register, which is fine, you can click that live link in front of you right now, and that will take you to an easy-to-fill-out form on our website, and you can apply for that credit. If you're an attorney and you're wondering about continuing legal education or CLE credits, they may or may not be provided for this program. They often are, but we do not pre-certify these programs, so you'll need to apply within your particular bar for those credits and see what requirements they have in that jurisdiction. If you need supporting materials for that, you can feel free to contact me. My email address is in front of you there, my phone number. Feel free to call or write. I will also let you know, if you're wondering about the slides, that we're going to post a recording of this program on the IAPP website within about 48 hours. And under the viewing window for the recording of this full webinar, including all the questions, we will post a link where you can download the slides and also download a certificate of attendance for this webinar. So I think that's about it. Thank you very much one last time, everybody, for joining.